I guess I'm on. Great. Welcome. Thank you for coming at this late time in the Tuesday afternoon. I appreciate everybody being here. I really thank you for the time that you're spending with us this week. And wanted to introduce myself, DC Tardy, Program Manager for Configuration Manager in Intune. And this is Jason Adams, that's also Program Manager as well. We'll be presenting together. Just want to walk you through a couple of the session objectives that I want you to take away. Essentially, we're going to talk through, I've had a lot of feedback right now. And in addition to that, I've also got the idea that from a lot of customers out there that we don't fully understand some role-based administration and how that's going to help us. So although some of you may have seen this before, I'm going to do a quick flyby through that. Additional to that, we're going to talk some into some of the troubleshooting pieces, some of the more interesting optimizations. Jason's going to handle some of those things, and then we'll again redress the customer profiles from the perspective of, okay, let's get this covered to make sure everybody understands what's going on with Configuration Manager and how it is simplifying and continuing to make your lives much simpler. But first, I want to go through these slides that you may have seen already. I'm trying to keep these very consistent. I want you to be sure to be getting the message that we are really focused continuously on user-centric management, while now we're also managing all the devices, all those mobile devices and additional modern devices that you're now very familiar with, and doing this very securely. More specifically, I wanted to talk about a message or an anecdote that I had over lunch. I was talking to somebody that sat at the table with me, and she's up in Canada, and her company goes out and contracts with other organizations, and they're having this influx of bring your own devices. And it's not a corporate policy in most of these places for people to bring their own devices. And therefore, we want to be able to give you the opportunity to manage those devices and not let your data leak out there and not feel in control of all of those devices that people are going to bring anyway, whether you have the policy or not. And that way we can make sure that we manage these devices. We manage these devices through the single console, the Configuration Manager console, and we're able to manage on-prem and in the cloud with the multiple devices that you see listed here. How many of you have already seen these slides before? Great. So I hope I've given the consistent message that you've heard already. And we'll just hop right into role-based administration. And the reason why I bring this back up, I know we're talking about advanced topics and troubleshooting, but I've been hit up with so many things even in the past 24 hours, less than 24 hours, so I decided to throw a demo together for this in the last hour, and I did do that. So you're going to see a tiny demo, but it's really focused on being able to wrap your minds around the fact that Configuration Manager no longer requires site servers to manage or give you scopes of administrative control. Site servers are there for scale-out purposes, not for scopes of administrative control. We do this through the security roles, the security scopes, and the collections, and applying that to administrative users in Configuration Manager so that you can scope down your interface. I heard one person talk about, I just don't get it. I'm still in 2007. I've got MMC console, and how's that going to work? So that's one of the reasons why I was going to throw up another short little demo. Another one was, I just don't understand how this is going to help me remove my sites and minimize my infrastructure footprint and keep my costs down in the organization. We'll quickly go through that through the different pieces of security roles, scopes, and collections. So as you're used to in 2007, certainly you have the ability to administer and set up those administrative scopes using the site servers. In this case, I use France and England, and we've got Louis and we've got Anthony in the different sites. You're probably very well familiar with this particular setup where you assign those administrative users to the specific primary sites for administrative purposes. However, in Configuration Manager 2012, I've removed those primary sites because since a primary site is a primary site is a primary site, all the administrative concepts, all the administrative controls are applied globally. Doesn't matter what primary is out there. So I've removed those primary sites out there, and Meg goes ahead and sets up the administrative users and assigns administrative accesses to the applications and the collections and makes those available. So let's go ahead and give you the idea that Louis from France and Anthony from England can manage all from that central administration site, those applications and devices, users, those collections, all from the central administration site. And in order to do that, they are able to be given permission by the full administrator, which was Meg, that you've seen earlier in the slide. Now, I'll just briefly show you a demo in just a minute, but what you've got to understand from a deployment standpoint when you're deploying applications is you've got in your minds a deployment concept of device deployment. I've got that here listed in the slide so you can understand that from the concepts of 2007, understanding device deployment. But again, we're really focused on the user-centric perspective, and you deploy just as easily to user collections as you do to the device collections that I've got listed here on the screen. So we've created a French collection. It's called French Systems. However, in this case, it's limited off the top level collection, which is the All Systems collection. All of the systems in your organization are in that collection, and you create a sub-collection that is limited to all of the devices that are in that top level collection. So you've got a hierarchy of collections. And then you create, Meg does the creation of this collection so that Louis can see the devices that are in this particular French Systems collection. So once Meg gives permission, Louis has access to read any of the devices and look at any of the devices deployed to, if he's got deployment rights, any of the devices in that collection. However, he is not enabled to change that collection. Now, what does that mean to you from making your footprint smaller? Again, it doesn't matter what primary site is out there. If Louis logs on to primary site 1, primary site 2, and so on, doesn't matter. Well, he can only see the French collections, or French Systems in this case. So he can't modify or delete those collections, but he is enabled to create sub-collections underneath. And again, applies to user collections, just as we're showing here is the device collections. So let's do a quick demonstration here. I've quickly created, I've kind of done a little, have a little fun with the name Louis, and I said Louis L'Amour. My grandfather's favorite author, Louis L'Amour, Western books, for those that are in America that understand that. And so Louis, I have already pre-created him. He's given the access rights to see all the French collections and French applications. And it's going a little bit, so there we go. So I've given him security roles. He's able to manage applications and deploy applications in this case. And for the scopes, I've given him the ability to look at the France security scope, which I have applied to applications, and I'll show that in just a minute. But also, he's able to see the collections, both devices and users and groups. So I'll just hop right on over to the assets and compliance so you can look at the collections that have been created. We've got a couple of collections here. If we look in the device collections, you'll see that there is the standard collections plus this France one that I added that has the French devices in there. And then also for user collections, we have French users and groups. Now, I'm logged in right now as Meg, the administrator, so I can see all of the device collections and all of the applications that exist in the system. So I've just given you a quick overview of what's there, but since Meg went ahead and assigned the appropriate collections, French devices, and French users and groups, and gave him the security roles, that those are what he's going to see when he opens up his administrative console. And those alone. But let me show you also in the software library that I added two applications. One is a UK application, and one is a French application, as you can see here clearly. Okay, so this is Meg's view. So let me real quickly open up what it would look like if Louis goes ahead and opens the console. Once Louis opens the console, he is going to be scoped down to see only those things he's been given access to, no matter where he logs on to at the central administration site or any primary site. And therefore, he's able to see, let's go to the user collections. He's able to see only the one French users and groups collection and only the French devices collection there. Okay? We go on to the software library and look under application management. You can see here that all of his options have also been removed from the console. He's not able to see all of the options that Meg's able to see. So it's been greatly simplified for him. But in this case, he's also only allowed to see the French application. Since I've given him the ability to go ahead and deploy, let's go ahead and deploy this application and just give you a quick front page view of this. Again, he's got the right to deploy applications, and the only collections that he can see are either these French user collection or the French device collections. All right? So let me close this out. What I wanted to point out here is, since I've had so many questions about this, this is going to help you keep your infrastructure much smaller than you're expecting that you have today in 2007, because even if you have 100 different primary sites out there today, you won't need that many sites to manage your environment, because you're able to scope down your administrative roles and accesses for your administrative users. That's what I wanted to communicate today, and you'll continue to hear that message, especially if you come to our conversation tomorrow as well. And at this time, I want to go ahead and move it on over to Jason to talk about some more information on boundaries.
Thanks, DC. Can everybody hear me? All right. So my name is Jason Adams, and I am passionate about performance and scale. So my team has been working for the last year and a half to identify best practices to help your organizations use Configuration Manager as efficiently as possible, whether that means using less power or less sites or less administrative overhead. So what I'm going to do is talk about a few areas, some best practices that we're going to start sharing now and over the next few months. After that, we'll be adding a few things as well, but we'll be focusing first on boundaries, and then we'll talk a little bit about hierarchy design and something we call the replication tax, and then we'll conclude with some SQL best practices before giving it back to DC to tide us on over. So boundaries. There's been a lot at this MMS about boundaries lately, and what we want to do is make sure that we're all on the same page about when you design a hierarchy, the impact of choices around boundaries on the performance of the systems, whether that be on the site server or with the actual access to the content and to the site assignment itself. So first off, let's all get on the same page about what we're talking about when we discuss boundaries. Let's analyze each of the boundary types, and then we'll discuss the recommendations that we as the product group have moving forward. So basically, a boundary is a segment of a network that you want to manage. A boundary in and of itself is just an entity. It doesn't mean anything until you've added it to a boundary group, which is what you can use to either set it for site assignment or for content location. There are three types of boundaries. There's the Active Directory site, the IP subnet, and IP ranges. And we'll talk about each one in turn. So to begin with, the Active Directory site boundary is the boundary that we normally would want customers to start their boundary strategy with. The idea is that an Active Directory site already faces many of the challenges that we do whenever we're designing an environment for content access, etc. It has to deal with slow links between sites. And so theoretically, if you've configured the Active Directory site, you should be able to mimic that same design and be able to get access and leverage that existing optimization of the bandwidth that's there. So it is a large container. We don't have any known issues around using it with assignment or with location requests. And from a performance perspective, the impact of using Active Directory site boundaries on your environment is very small. It's a very easy comparison in SQL. It's basically a blip on the radar. Now, there are some problems in that, and it's not necessarily with Active Directory site boundaries themselves. It's the fact that they take a dependency on Active Directory. And I just want to see a show of hands. Who here has an Active Directory site that has properly configured subnets? Okay, so not just a ton. The other issue is that Active Directory sites support supernetting, to use aggregation of subnets. So when we try to read out of Active Directory the subnets for a client, we get back a figure that doesn't actually match the subnet that the site is on. So we have dependencies here on those Active Directory sites, and if they are properly configured, they're fantastic. But if they're not, then you have to start supplementing your boundary strategy. So that brings us to the IP subnet boundary. Now, I have come to understand that some people think the IP subnet is evil, that there are problems with it and that you should never use them. Now, I think that's a bit unfair. The IP subnet is actually a very good boundary tool for the content location piece. It's extremely inexpensive. Of all the different boundary types that are out there, to go to evaluate the boundaries for any of our different lookups, be it for site assignment or for content location, the IP subnet boundary is a direct comparison, flies right through. The problem is that it's been a long time since we've used IP subnet in and of itself as a way to describe a network boundary. Oftentimes we use CIDR notation, and oftentimes when we look at a network diagram, a supernet is used to aggregate those subnets. So sometimes it's hard to understand exactly what the subnets are in a given area, even if you're working with your network team. So it can be very difficult sometimes to find the actual subnets. In addition, people use tons and tons of subnets all throughout all these different environments, which means that if you use strictly subnets, then you will have an awful lot of boundaries in your environment. And then finally, we do know of some issues, going back to that AD site issue. If an AD site is configured with supernets for aggregation, there will be a mismatch between the subnet that the client knows about and the subnet that's discovered in Active Directory, which can lead to some confusion during site assignment. When you look at the client in your console, it will not appear to be assigned to a site. Now, bear in mind that if you actually deploy the client, it will find everything just fine and match everything correctly, but it is something that is a wrinkle when designing your subnet strategy, or sorry, your boundary strategy. Which brings us to the IP range boundary. Now, the IP range boundary, when it was first introduced in SMS 2003, could not be used for site assignment, but was used for content location requests. It's very easy to understand. It's basically a range of IPs from here to here. You don't have to understand networking concepts. It's very easy to communicate, very easy to pick up. It's a very good user experience. The problem with IP range boundaries is because it's taken from a list of values within the database, it's extremely expensive, prohibitively so. And if more than a few are used, it can actually have effects on the operation of SQL and can lead to issues. So there is a place for the IP range boundary, but it's one that must be used in moderation. So let's talk about, that's not an overview, that should be a recommendation. Anyway, so let's talk about what all this means. So in general, boundaries are something that you should use in moderation, and you should use them efficiently. You should have boundaries that map to the exact utilization that you need. You shouldn't add extra boundaries, nor should you take a certain type of boundary and try to convert it into another. The problem with characterizing any given type of boundary as evil means that you start removing it from your quiver of options to use. Now, from a performance standpoint, as I mentioned, I'm passionate about performance, I would probably say that I think the IP range boundary is evil. However, I know that it has a role. And the same thing for the IP subnet. It has a role as well. So the takeaway here, use as few boundaries as possible. In general, and we'll get to this in a second, try to use fewer sites as well so you don't have the necessity for additional site assignment boundaries. Where possible, try to use the AD site boundary. I know we only had a few people who had properly configured subnets in their AD site, but if you can, try to use that AD site because theoretically it should already map to the bandwidth issues in your environment. And if you're going to have a large number of boundaries, prefer the IP subnet boundary. One issue that we have seen with customers is taking this IP subnet is evil thing and running with it. They've taken subnet boundaries and converted them to ranges. They already knew their subnets. They could have used the subnet boundary, but for some reason they move forward with using a range instead. So in this case, if you know you have to have a lot of boundaries, then prefer those subnet boundaries because they're actually very inexpensive in SQL. You can do a lot of location requests. You can do a lot of checks against it. Just flies right through on SQL. And then use those IP range boundaries where you need them. And in the end, I'll take you back up to the top here. If you're finding yourself in a scenario in which you have a ratio of clients to boundaries of more than 100 to 1, so let's say you have 40,000 clients you're managing, and you have 10,000 boundaries, averaging 4 clients to a boundary, that's a danger zone. You should step back a little bit and figure out exactly what your boundary strategy should be. That's not saying that you should never have a lot of boundaries. If you have to, then you just kind of have to. But always keep these things in mind, and if you know you're going to have a large number, we know which ones that we should go with, those cheap IP subnet boundaries, in order to accomplish your goals. All right, so moving from boundaries and their impact on performance, let's also talk about replication principles. Now, replication is very new and very different in 2012. It's a totally different model from 2007. Now, you heard DC talking a little bit about some of the reasons to have fewer sites, and one of the things he called out was the fact that a site is no longer unique. A site is a site is a site. I like to say that sites are no longer precious snowflakes. It used to be in the past that a site had all kinds of special little things on it, things that you'd built, things that you'd added, stuff that had never replicated to another primary. In the old days, if you wanted to move that across, you had to deal with all kinds of special workarounds. You had to make one site a child of another, let stuff flow down, switch it around, let stuff flow up. You don't have to do that anymore in the new replicated world. But in this new replicated world as well, there are different principles to design because these sites really function in a different way. So some core principles as we move forward is that you should use as few sites as possible. There is replication overhead, and we'll be introducing a concept of the replication tax. You should only increase your site count in order to support additional devices. So in a perfect world, if you had 150,000 clients under management, you would use 2 sites, because 100,000 is the maximum per site. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. We do have some geographic presence issues. We know there are some regulations about where content can actually be located and seen. We know also that there are some limitations within our product around the network access account that you can only have 1 per primary site. So in that case, if you do a lot of things with a network access account, you do need to have another primary site. But other than that, many of the other bottlenecks that came with the release of RTM, such as the only having 1 SUP per primary site, have been resolved. You can have multiple primaries, you can have multiple sites. The new world is to have well-connected site servers and then to put site roles in proximity to the clients that they'll be managing. So when you're designing, be thinking about where is your max throughput? Where is your link that you trust? And across that link, that is where you're going to put your site servers. The site roles have the ability to throttle. They have the ability to wait. There are no issues if they can't talk to each other. There may be a little bit of latency, but those are the ones that you would put over a slightly slower link. So when you're designing, keep those things in mind. And there are also other network considerations, how much replication you can do, scheduling, things like that. My peer DC will be coming up to talk about some of those things after I finish here. So that takes us into the replication tax. So let's start with basic concepts. What is replication? What are we replicating? And here are some examples. So global data is going to be replicated everywhere within a hierarchy. And you can see that global data is really most of the fun stuff. It's your collections, your packages, everything that you're creating, all the value that you're building for your customer so they can consume the offering and move forward with it. Site data, on the other hand, typically is data that's collected from clients and used for reporting purposes or monitoring purposes, et cetera. And some of that data is replicated up to the central site. So in any kind of a replication model, the distributor will always be a bottleneck, and that is not unique here with Configuration Manager. Your central administration site will be your bottleneck for replication. Bear in mind that global data we talked about, that has to go to every single site. It doesn't just go to the site where you need it at. And so if you think about it, the more sites you have, the more of an impact that replication will be. So let's take an example. Let's take an infrastructure trying to support 40,000 clients. Now, it is extremely possible, in fact, I would say it's the preferred experience, to manage those 40,000 clients with one single standalone primary. Now, we can do a little bit of math around this. With only one site, we don't ever have to send a copy to anywhere else. And there's only one copy in the environment. So as far as administrative overhead and network, you don't have to manage an additional location, an additional site. You don't have to manage additional network bandwidth from communication between site servers. You have one site. And bear in mind that clients in and of themselves will be talking to a group of MPs and DPs down below. So the number of sites does not affect the traffic from clients themselves. They will always be talking to an MP, which will always be talking to SQL somewhere. So let's take our standalone primary, which, by the way, is chugging along here with just one site and with no additional network traffic, managing 40,000 systems with no problems. And now let's go ahead and try and turn it into a hierarchy. So we've now changed into a central administration side with a single peer. We see this in a lot of places. So what does this look like from a replication perspective? Well, now, for that same 40,000 clients, you have the same amount of traffic as those clients talk to MPs and DPs, et cetera. But now, you're adding an additional layer. Every time you create something, be it on the primary side or on the central, there's now some network bandwidth being sucked up by the creation or the editing of that object. You now also have two places that you have to store this. That's two SQL instances, two site servers you now have to administer and take care of. Let's extend it out some more. This is the same 40,000 clients, right? 40,000 clients, they're already chugging along in the background. They're talking to their MPs, their DPs. That has not changed. We are not changing anything with the core offering of giving service to our clients. But now we've added another site system. Well, look at this. Now we've got some additional bandwidth being sucked up. Every time we make a change, every time we add an object, we now have these replications going on. It's not adding any additional value to our customer. We're just replicating. Now we have another site server, another SQL instance we have to take care of. And it goes on and on. When you actually look at the math of replication, you can see that the administrative profile for just one site server is far easier. You have one box. Maybe you have remote SQL. But there's no difference in what the clients are talking to. There's no value add there. And you can see that as you add sites, and you can go past 10 all the way up to the 25 that we support, what you're seeing is a gradual accrual of additional tax on the environment. Now, once again, is this unique to Configuration Manager? No. Any replication topology would have this situation. This is just the way it works when you have a perfectly replicated system. And you have to take that into effect when designing it. So we've talked about theory, now let's talk about implementation. So I talked about my team before, the folks back in the lab who are building these large environments and benchmarking and baselining some of these best practices to make sure that they work for you folks. And we have a lab that we run. We call it a bathtub test, where basically we take a set load, in this case 400,000 clients executing a patch Tuesday, and we run that load against different environments. And what we do is we time how long it takes for that environment to chew through that load. So obviously this is a stress scenario. Very few people in the world have 400,000 clients running a patch Tuesday. But it's interesting because when you have that much load in the server, you can very much see the differences between the way the system handles it. So we have two different types of labs that we use. We take one lab that has the bare minimum number of sites that you would need for 400,000 users. That would be 4 sites. And yes, you can indeed manage 400,000 users with 4 sites. And then we compared it to the exact same load being processed on an environment with 10 sites. Right? The only difference here, same generators, same loads, same everything from the client's perspective. The only difference here is the number of primary sites and where they're being pointed. And you can see that the results were very different. On a 4 site, what we call our narrow load, we can clear that backlog and get back to a steady state in 14 hours. You have 10 sites, it goes up to 26 hours. So that is the tax. What the tax looks like is on the CAS, the CPU is maxed. That means other things have to wait. Now, does this mean that everything comes to a grinding halt and we can't do anything? No. It just means it takes longer. And what it means is that replication tax I've used the word means quite a bit. What this says is that the replication tax will occur at times when your system is under the most stress, and probably the time that you'll be under the most stress. And so when designing your system, you should take that into consideration and use the smallest possible footprint for building that environment. So that is the replication tax. Let's talk a little bit about some SQL best practices. Because without SQL, what's Configuration Manager, right? So we've got 3 things that have been sort of received wisdom. A lot of administrators out in the field have been doing them. I just want to cover them real quick and make sure that all the folks in the room are on the same page, that if you want to get the most out of SQL, that enabling these things and doing these things are the sort of things you should have ready to go, whether it's something that's in the toolkit that you'll take out in case of an issue, or if it's something that you have already programmed into your SQL maintenance plan and it happens every day at midnight. So first things first, we have a task that's built into the site server for rebuilding indexes. Now, I can tell you that indexes are very important, and I'm going to go ahead and stipulate it right now that indexed columns work faster than other columns. Now, there is a limit to that. You can do what's called an over-index, and this rebuild indexes task takes that into effect. But the 3 things that it does is it basically looks at the columns within your database, and it figures out the uniqueness values on those columns, and either adds or removes indexes depending on how unique the values are there. That avoids that over-indexing consideration. It then rebuilds the existing indexes as well as any new indexes that have been added. What this does is it keeps the data fresh so that when the queries run, they will run faster, they'll execute faster, and you won't have stale data or stale information that will prevent that fast execution that you're using. This is a task that you can turn on in your in the Config Manager maintenance tasks. So something you have to turn on, it's available by default, it's turned off. But if you're in any kind of a scale environment, any kind of a large environment, we definitely recommend that you have this turned on. Another best practice that is a little bit new, but there's been discussion about it in the past, is this idea of using multiple file groups for SQL. So a file group allows multiple read-write heads to take on a given burden when processing a SQL query. The idea is to create multiple file groups across the SQL file. You can go very deep here and actually create a situation in which a specific file group is dedicated to a particular table. Now, we don't have any recommendations whatsoever about that. Folks are floating around saying, hey, that sounds like it'd be a great idea. It's sure. Maybe that sounds like a great idea, but we don't have a support statement around it. What we do have a statement, though, is about the temp DB. Because when we look at the way that reports run, when we look at the way our store procedures run, the temp DB is that bottleneck. And so we are creating a recommendation that you follow the SQL best practice of using multiple file groups for your SQL temp DB. And here's a sample of one of the temp DB setups that we have for one of our internal labs. Originally, when SQL came out with this guidance, they said that you should have one file group for every 2 cores that you had. And then, of course, we had the explosion of cores, and people had 48 cores. And subsequent investigation revealed that once you get past 8 file groups, you start to lose some of your some of the benefit of having the multiple file groups. So in this case, though, if you can put your temp DB across multiple file groups, you can realize significant gains from the process of the temp database. And finally, there's this idea of updating statistics. So when SQL actually runs a query, it'll actually create a query plan, and it does so using statistics that it keeps on the existing database. Now, SQL updates those statistics regularly on its own schedule, basically finding set times that you can use to bring those up to date. The problem is, what happens if SQL is so consumed with a lot of long-running processes that it never gets an opportunity to calculate or recalculate or update the statistics? So one thing that we definitely recommend is if you are seeing a scenario in which you are SQL CPU bound, right? If you're seeing that SQL CPU is occupying 99%, never coming back, we have seen exceptional performance gains by updating those statistics, because what that does is it brings all the information for the query plans back into FORB, and when the query is run again, it runs much faster because it has up-to-date information. Now, I will say this, updating statistics is not considered a trivial task. There's a reason why the SQL team recommends that you allow SQL to do it. I have heard of customers who have set up their own tasks to just go ahead and run the update statistics job on their own. But officially, the guidance is to let SQL do it on its own. And then if you see behavior, and the behavior is being SQL CPU bound, having high SQL CPU percentage, that you give this a try and see if that resolves your issue. All right. And now we'll come back and take us through some optimizations.
Optimizing replication traffic. Tomorrow morning at 10:15, we're going to go into more, well, it's going to be introductions of what's new in SP1, and it includes some of the things that I'm going to talk about here. And specifically, I've had some feedback from you that in regard to knowing what in the world is going across that network, right? How much data am I pumping across my networks? And I've got some networks that don't look like other networks. And therefore, what I mean by that is you have some networks that, let's say they're flaky, or they've got higher latency, or they go down, I guess that falls in the flaky mode, on a semi-periodic basis. And because of that, we've added a few things to enable you to give better, accurate information on that replication. So, what I'll show you tomorrow are some additional reports that you have available to you to provide the information of what data is being transferred, how big is the data, what kind of data is being transferred across the network. So when we talk about the replication tax, this really falls into line when you have a central administration site and all of the different primary sites that you might have underneath it. Obviously, this does not apply if you're managing your environment with a single primary site, which I think the majority of you will have the opportunity to accomplish. However, for those that require a central administration site, for these reports, you can additionally use your own report creations to make use of the views that are available to expound upon the reports that are there. But I'll give you tomorrow at 10:15 a little more explanation or some screenshots / demo on what that kind of looks like as to what those reports will give you. Additional to that, the alerting on those links between two different primary and a central administration site, what it takes to configure those so that you get alerted when a site replication is looking like it might be going bad, going into a degraded mode, or looking like when it's actually failed. And being able to configure that on a link-by-link basis instead of just taking whatever Microsoft says that it should be standard across your entire environment. Let you configure that for yourself. More specifically, I'll show you that tomorrow on how you actually configure that, but what that means to you is less false positives on your network alerts when you get to degraded and when you get to failures. As Jason showed you in a Patch Tuesday scenario with multiple sites, you got from 14 hours to 26 hours. In some cases, you would start going to degraded, and in some cases, for devices that are over failed links or flaky links, you might even go to failed. And you might know that that's the case, and you might know that you need to expect that. Therefore, you're able to configure it so that your operations don't automatically call you up in the middle of the night, get you out of bed, and say, your links are failed, what do we do? So that's what we're able to give to you. So come back tomorrow, we'll show you how that's set up. Now, kind of wrapping this little bow up on what we've been talking about here on really helping you out with reducing and improving your performance of your environment for Configuration Manager. This has been a slide that we've talked about quite a bit over the years, specifically about simplifying your footprint. We continually add to that simplification. We're now adding those simplification pieces, as we just discussed today, to give you the ability to run with a single primary site in your entire environment using your role-based administration so that you don't have to proliferate primary sites throughout your environment. And we want to, as you'll see in tomorrow's presentation, give you more control over this, what some people have called a black box of replication, more insight into what's going on into the system so you don't get lost and have to go talk to your SQL DBAs if your environment has a DBA team and a configuration manager team. You can do that all from the in-console monitoring. So those are the big ticket items that we wanted to be trustworthy with, show you the right information, give you the better and quicker, smaller footprint. So just a quick little legend. It's going to be at the bottom of each of the slides. Some of you also, I wanted to point out when you make decisions to throw out your roles and your site servers. And for the next few slides, just to give you a quick little company profile, we've got a subsidiary in London with your headquarters in Chicago customer profile that has 2 to 4 administrators with 125,000 clients. So bing, 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 bing. That tells you that you're going to need more than one primary site, obviously, because you have more than 100,000 users. Now, let me step back real quick. If that said 75,000 users or devices, if that said 100,000 devices, and you still had this same Chicago headquarters, London subsidiary, you don't necessarily need a central administration site. You could do that with one single site server, one standalone primary server. But in this case, I'm going to kind of go big and kind of show you the options that are available here. And again, normal operating procedures in this profile, having standard application delivery and so forth. And then finally, let's talk about that central administration site. This is when you need a central administration site. more than one primary site in your hierarchy, which what we're trying to stress here is you go over 100,000 users. Jason had listed a couple of caveats in there when you might need extra primary site, but that's when you need a central administration site, and if you're over 100,000 users. Okay, let's look about when we need a primary site server. With the 74,000 clients and 1,000 servers in the headquarters, we can scale to, again, 100,000 clients in the primary site, and that helps us reduce the primary site failure, but we can move then the administrator from that primary site and manage directly from the central administration site. So all administration, when you have a central administration site, you should really focus on putting those administrators access or always logging in with the console to the central administration site, because it doesn't have the tax of actually having to manage all of the clients, and that's where administration should occur. Finally, additionally, in the subsidiary in London, an example here would be 49,000 clients and so forth, that you would have another primary site over there. You'd have this primary site over there for, obviously, the two reasons that I talked about, or one additional reason that I talked about was you have more than 100,000 users or 100,000 devices. The additional reason that you might, Jason already pointed out, is you have content regulations where that particular content that you have in your line of business application, let's say that's delivered and made in the UK, for governmental reasons can't go outside of the UK, you'll put a primary site in that location because you don't want the content to be replicated and put in other locations. So these are not the reasons to have an additional primary site. Again, pointing out the fact that we've got role-based administration, so we do the decentralized administration. And again, for these additional pieces, logical segmentation, client settings, language, and you don't need primary sites, what we haven't stressed, but have stressed in the past, for content routing. We can do content routing for, and I'll show you that in just a minute, with secondary sites. So here, when do we need a secondary site server? What I didn't put on this slide, and I just realized it, was content routing in addition to managing the upward flow of traffic. Now, this is an advanced, I'm going to give you an advanced tip that I didn't put on this slide. So listen closely. It'll be on the recording so you can have it. In RTM version, we gave you the ability to remove the management point from this secondary site server and allow you to go ahead and distribute content only with those secondary site servers. In SP1, I'll take the blame for it. I've now grayed out that option, and you can't, through the administrative console, remove that management point. However, the good news, save my rear end, you can use the SDK to go ahead and move, and officially supported, remove that management point from that secondary site server, so you don't have to have the management point on that secondary site server. Now for distribution points. When we talk about distribution points, we talk about distribution points from the fact that you can stick those distribution points, as Jason pointed out, close to the clients to which they're managed, which you already know and do today, but you have used primary sites and secondary sites to help route that content around and keep it throttled and scheduled. Now you can do that directly and continue to do that directly with the distribution points themselves. And so you make the decision with those distribution points to effectively throttle and schedule the content alone, so you don't have to have another site server out there. Additionally, we've gone to one We've got another one I'll show you, the cloud distribution point, which you will hear about in other conversation, other presentations, but essentially one or two with the cloud distribution point roles. So one distribution point is now able to run on a server itself or able to run on client operating system, as I pointed out here from a branch cache perspective, you can run it on these client operating systems. Now, this is the cloud distribution point that I was discussing just a minute ago about the additional role that we've added here. That additional role gives the ability to put client content out in the cloud. And for the woo-moo stuff, for all of your patches, it goes back to Microsoft to get that, so you don't have to use your storage on that cloud distribution point out in Azure. Okay? That's what we want to point it out in this case here. So in wrap-up, we've really kind of gone through the major points to really push optimizations throughout your configuration manager hierarchy. We've really stressed the reasons to keep your configuration manager hierarchy close and narrow, as Jason pointed out, in as few of primary sites as possible. And we've additionally given you the reminders of why you don't need those additional primary sites because of the role-based administration, really giving you that control to delegate administration without actually having to put primary sites out in those locations. And that's the end of their discussion. If, Jason, you want to come back and come up on board, we want to take some questions that you may have for us.
He's got a question.
Since I've heard 4 different answers.
Uh-oh.
In this conference.
Oh.
Not good.
SQL Server.
On the same box.
Co-location.
As your primary site?
Yep.
Or separate? I have 50,000, almost 50,000 clients, about 2,000 packages, a lot of collections, about 300 sites around the world.
Well, so
Right on that 50,000 mark.
Repeat the question. So you don't have a question yet. You're telling me you've heard 4 different things.
yeah.
I've asked 4 different people, I got 4 different answers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the actual question is, should you have...
What is your question first?
So should I co-locate SQL on the same box as my primary? Number 1. Or
Yeah.
number 2, if I don't, if I do put it on there, do I want to move all my client-facing roles to a different box? If I do leave it on that box with SQL Server standards, am I going to hit a brick wall with 50,000?
So I think...
So
to answer
repeat
that
the question. Repeat the question
Yeah.
for the people on the recording.
I'm repeating the question for the people on the recording. So the question is, should I co-locate or not co-locate? And then you have some specifics about, well, you've got 50,000 clients and you've got X number of applications, what have you. I think the reason why you may be hearing different responses to that is that the real answer is that it depends. There's a lot of ways you can configure that. I'm a big fan of the MP replica myself. Things that you can do to try and offload from SQL, that SQL traffic, and maybe take that approach if you're getting a lot of client activity. Depending on what you're using, what you've got turned on, what you're gathering, how often you're in reports, it can work just fine with it co-located. If you are seeing some issues, then you can also offload it, but then the caveats there are that you now have an additional box to run. You've got you need to make sure you have that bandwidth there so that you can have the throughput to SQL, et cetera. On the flip side, though, we have seen starvation issues in which SQL starves out configuration managers. So once again, it's not probably the best answer. There's a lot of knobs to turn within the product. It really depends on what you're seeing. And what I can tell you is that there's a ton of different options available to you to tweak and to do different things. I just don't think there's a hard and fast answer to that question for you.
And so for the hard line on this, the product group will not give you a specific answer because of the depends situation. You'll need to go directly to maybe a consulting like MCS to get and view your entire architecture, systems architecture, and make that decision for you. And so those talk to the TAM and get the right answer for your organization, because it's going to vary. There's one organization that could have it co-located, another organization that it doesn't make sense to have it co-located.
So is there a brick wall at 50K?
No.
No, there's no brick wall.
The only brick wall with regards to 50K is on the CAS if you have...
Oh, so if you're talking about a 50,000 limit that you're thinking of, that 50,000 limit has to do with the fact of if you're ever going to put a central administration site into production, you're going to want to have that central administration site up and running on SQL Enterprise, SQL version Enterprise, prior to ever doing anything. That's what that 50,000 is all about.
So if you're just using a standalone primary, then a standard should be fine. But that's the only 50K limitation that's actually hard-coded into the product.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So there may also be some other confusion based on, we have some hardware guidance and performance guidance posted in the TechNet documentation.
Sure.
And there's a breakdown of, there's like one type of hardware or one hardware spec that's listed as for 50,000 clients, basically a standalone primary that's all encompassing with everything on the same box. And then there's another set of hardware that says, up to 100,000 clients on a primary site with SQL offloaded. But that's just general guidance. That's not a, hey, there's a hard-coded block or anything.
Yeah, that's basically saying when we do internal testing, this is what we're doing, but bear in mind that those are, so when we're not making a jump from 50,000 to 50,001, we're doing a jump from 50,000 to 100,000.
So just to give a little bolster to that information about the SQL Enterprise on the central administration side, even though you're not doing it for everybody in the room, so everyone knows the reasoning behind that is to improve performance. We do something at the central administration side to improve the replication between the primaries using SQL partitioning that is only available on SQL Enterprise SKU. And that's the whole reason for deploying 50,000, that 50,000 number, if you will. Any other questions? Yes.
About the distribution point upgrades, is it different when you migrate and then you upgrade distribution points as part of the migration process versus standing up a new distribution point role on a server straight from 2012 without doing the migration? Because when I noticed when I did it, it says site system after I do the upgrade. And I know it's not a secondary site, it doesn't even use it and everything. I'm just wondering if it's still treated a little differently versus where you just, you just stand up and assign a distribution point role to the server without, separate from migrating.
So for your question, are you talking about when it's still the shared resource with Configuration Manager, 2007?
And then you say upgrade at that point.
Shared distribution point scenarios?
You go, yeah, they're shared, and then you go and upgrade one.
So after upgrade a previously shared distribution point.
Yeah.
So
versus just, assigning a distribution point role to a server that doesn't have a shared.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking if there's any difference between a distribution point that's set up, just a normal distribution point in 2012 and one that's been migrated from being a shared distribution point. I don't have any specific. DC, do you have anything? Or?
No. So for specifics, come up after we're done here, and it shares a little more detail on the scenario. So
Yeah, we'll find out if we need to. All right.
questions over here.
Oh, wait, there's one over here.
Okay, over there.
So for this single pane of glass, Okay. So this
It
is
has,
Azure.
this is not, this not, or the Cloud DP?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
So the question is,
I didn't actually hear
for the
the
Cloud
question.
DP scenario, you mentioned something about Intune.
That's a very good question. So it's going to happen when you've enabled.
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, good question. Thank you. Good statement. Repeat the question is, when does the client go to the cloud distribution point? Essentially your question, is that right? Right. So you've got to enable the fact that you can roam the client, right? So you can get client, and you have to make sure that the client is not able to get its content from anywhere else in the enterprise. So if it's set up to go to any of the other distribution points, then it will go there first and not go out there. So you've essentially got to, it's going to be the very last option that a client has to go and get the content out in the cloud distribution point.
Does that answer the question, or? Okay. All right, one more back here. Yeah, there we go. See, now I don't have to repeat it.
Is there any detailed documentation on the replication traffic, what's replicated and how big it is?
No, because that varies by organization on what traffic is replicated.
Yeah, I'm not talking about like how much my traffic is, but like, is it global data? These are the things that are replicated, and you know, this is the penalty for each type of replicated object or type.
So what you'll find. So the answer is no. The short answer is no. The partial answer is in the added pieces that we've put for in-console monitoring for replication, we've given you additional information on what is global data, what is site data, and what is going to be replicated in that fashion. The problem really gets into the fact that we don't know how much your MOF is going to tell us to replicate for your hardware, as an example. That's just an example. And that's where it gets really difficult to give that type of information.
Definition of the type of data is in TechNet now?
I didn't hear the question.
That definition of the type of data is now in the TechNet documentation?
The definition of the data that's replicated is in the SP1 documentation in reference to what is in the console.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Questions?
I have a question.
I have a question.
How many of you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I guess I'm kind of wondering around secondary sites. Do I do them or don't I do them? I've got a geographically dispersed environment, and I'm worried about clients reaching back from, say, Europe back to the U.S.
When you're worried about that upward flow of traffic for the client data, and you're concerned about that network traffic and aggregating it, then yes, that's a good rule of thumb. I can't tell you, yes, it's what you have to do. It's something that is a good rule of thumb to do.
Yeah.
That's what's the recommendation there.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly.
So yeah, I just had a quick question. So how many folks in the room are managing enterprises with more than 100,000 clients? I'm just curious. We got 1, 2, 4, 5. All right, so we've got like 4 or 5. So how many folks are using, or actually it's more over here, 6, 7, 8. How many folks are using hierarchies as opposed to standalone primaries? So it seems like most folks are using standalone primaries? Is that a fair assessment?
It looked like half and half to
Half
me.
and half, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. How many
Yeah.
people wish they'd set up a standalone primary? All right, there we go.
Yeah. At least one.
Yeah? Okay, any other questions? Oh, way in the back.
Yes, you do need SQL. SQL will install as part of installing the primary. SQL Express will install. And that's R2, 2008 R2, which gives a 10 gigabyte limit of the data, but it's plenty to handle the data that the secondary site will handle.
So just the question was, do you still need SQL if you remove the management point?
With or without the management point, SQL must be there on the SQL on the secondary site server. Please use the microphone for the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but okay. So you're using the microphone. You can go now. Yeah, and then we'll come back.
One other question. If, for instance, I have multiple software update points in my single primary site, and I put a software update point in London, for example, in this drawing here, if there's only a single primary site and that software update point in London goes down, will all my clients try to completely resync their software update catalogs with the software update point in America? And would an additional primary site prevent that?
So it does take a bit of time for the software update list, sup list, if you will, to update and change over to another sup. I don't know if that's what you asked. I think I'm answering a different question. You were asking if a primary site went down versus a software update
Did
point.
you say a primary site or the SUP? I thought you said
Yeah,
SUP.
the SUP went down. So I have a single,
Okay.
let's say I had a single primary site and I had a SUP in London,
Sure.
and
Okay.
that SUP went down. I'm assuming all my clients will then go back to, Chicago or wherever this.
It will eventually go back.
Yeah. Okay. And if I put a primary site in London, that wouldn't happen, right?
If you put a primary site in London, it has to do with what SUP is available for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dave?
And it's not instantaneous that it does this switch. It actually takes time for it to lose its affinity to its software update point, even if it can't talk to it. So you should have time to remediate whatever issue that you've had. But it is actually a performance issue doing that reassignment to a different sub.
Yeah.
So,
And you'll hear additional information from the presentation that's on this. I don't know what time it is. If you'll
Tomorrow,
take a look,
the one you were talking about for replication?
not for replication, but at the updates one, and I forget what time it is. So
Okay.
take a look for that one. Yeah.
Thanks.
Dave, did you have something you want to add? Okay.
all right, any other questions?
We appreciate your time here today. Thanks a lot. Have a wonderful evening.